Today I'm going to be going over every book I've read so far this year. I'm going to be doing a little mini review over each one, I'm going to be rating each one, and then I'm going to rank them from my favorite to my least favorite. So let's get started. The very first book I read this year was Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. This book was one of my most anticipated of the year. It's been sold to me by some of my favorite booktubers as sort of a mix of Dune and Name of the Wind, which you can't go wrong with. However, I did not feel this way. What I was supposed to be getting was a mix of Dune and Name of the Wind. What I really got was fan fiction of Dune and Book of the New Sun. And I don't want to discount Christopher Rocchio's writing ability. He is a very good writer. And I have so much to say about this. I have so many strong opinions about this book. It's one of the 3 videos on this list that is going to be getting a full review on my channel. But for the sake of this video, it's going to get 2 out of 5 stars. But like I said, I have so much to say about this book. So like and subscribe to get notified when that review drops. So unfortunately, because of how long it took me to power through Empire of Silence, that was the only book I actually finished in January, which is abnormal for me. I typically get through 3 books a month, maybe 4. But yeah, this next book was started in January, but at the end of January, and took me into February, which was Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert. And going from the fan fiction of this series to the real deal was a breath of fresh air. I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and you hear that the Dune Messiah isn't as good as Dune, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. This book added so much to the story and was honestly great from beginning all the way to the end. And honestly, the contrast of this book to the book I read before it just made it all that much better. Dune Messiah is getting 5 out of 5 stars and continues to be one of my favorite science fiction series of all time. One of my favorite book series of all time, really. Continuing in February, I got my first Sanderson box. I got Atress of the Emerald Sea, and this was a book I was hesitantly excited about. I thought this was a book that would add more to the Cosmere, which is exciting. But the premise of the book sounded kind of silly to me. I wasn't excited for the book, per se. I was more excited about getting another world to the Cosmere. But I was wrong. This book is essentially just Brandon Sanderson showing off. And this is a great example contrasting to Empire of Silence, which I described as more fan fiction of Dune than being inspired by it. You could tell this book was inspired by Princess Bride, but was just seeping in originality. You could tell it had the same tone, but was its own story. While introducing a whole new world, lore, and magic system, Brandon Sanderson in this book was able to create some of the most memorable characters with the strongest relationships and bonds, all while showing really cool sea battles. Seriously, some of the best ship fighting scenes I've ever read in fantasy, period. This book I thought might be a 3 or a 4, but it ended up getting a full 5 out of 5 stars. And that brings me to my last book of February, which is Bloody Rose by Nicholas Eames. It's the second book in the band series, and this is a book that was on my TBR, but I wasn't really planning on reading it yet. It's part of the research I'm doing for a video that goes over all the different ways to listen to audiobooks. And I actually listened to this one on the Libby app, which is a library on your phone, and you can actually get free audiobooks from this audiobook application. So I jumped into this book because it is the first book on that app that became available for me to read for free. I'm somebody who really believes that you can ruin a book by beginning it with the wrong expectations. And this is a perfect example of a book that if you read it, if you start this book thinking you're getting Kings of the Wild, the first book in this series, you're going to be heavily disappointed because this one does not have nearly the same tone, it's not as goofy at all, and has more of a serious undertone to it. Fortunately, I actually went into this book without those expectations. I went into this book with as few expectations as I think was possible, and I did end up enjoying the book. However, it was just good. It wasn't bad, it was just It didn't really do anything for me. I didn't connect to many of the characters, and there was nothing really that just knocked my socks off in this book. Honestly, I've already forgotten so much about it, and I imagine I'll continue to forget as time goes on. I'd say this book gets a solid 3 out of 5 stars, and I'm so glad I went in with the right expectations, because if you went in thinking you were getting Kings, I think you'd be rating this book 2, maybe 1 stars, but it's a solid 3 out of 5 for me. After that, we get into March, and I'm still using the Libby app, and it finally forced me to read a book I have been talking about reading literally since I started this channel. I think when I made my tier list of the books on my TBR, like ranking them from the ones I was most eager to get started to the ones I was like, this could wait. This is like at the bottom of my TBR. This was probably the next one, and I'm just now getting to it. And I think I made that book of summer of last year. And that's Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This book and this series and this author is probably the number one most recommended book, series, and author by people on my BookTube channel. Like, people in the comments are constantly telling me I need to jump into this book, and I 100% see why. It's a slow-paced book where, honestly, throughout the story, not a lot happens. Yet as you go through the story, there are times you're on the edge of your seat, just living through these experiences with Fitz. It's a story I couldn't stop listening to while I was reading it, and then it's one I've constantly found myself thinking back to as I've moved on from that book onto other books. Now, I will say, I do think I missed the perfect opportunity for me to read this book. I think that if this was a book I had read as a child, when I was first getting started into fantasy, this would have been in my top 3 favorites of all time. I do. However, now as an adult, I don't think it has the same connection with me that so many of you guys got as reading this as one of your original entries into the fantasy genre. I don't think I got that experience, but it is still a solid book. It gets a 5 out of 5 stars for me, and honestly is one of those books that I can universally recommend to anyone in the fantasy genre, which is very rare because a lot of my favorite books I can't recommend to everyone. They are more specific. This is one of the most universal reads I think is out there, and is probably why so many people have recommended it to me. And if you can't tell, I'm really enjoying this Libby app. I'm getting all these audiobooks for free, and so I started it beginning of February, and I'm already in mid-March, and I'm still using that app. And the next book that came available to me was Crimson Campaign by Brian McClellan, but it's the second book in the Powder Mage trilogy. And this is one of the books I have the least to say about. It was a solid entry. There wasn't much development in the characters, I don't think. There wasn't even much of a plot. It was essentially action from beginning to end, but I enjoyed it. Like, I have nothing really bad to say. I think it lacked greatness, but was also better than just, which is why I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. And honestly, it's weird that I'm rating it that high, because I don't remember a ton about the story like I do the first one. The first one's a 5 out of 5 stars. I remember a ton. This one, I don't remember a ton about, but I do remember really enjoying reading it or listening to it. So 4 out of 5. The next book was my most anticipated book of the year. I said that I thought that Empire of Silence was. I was wrong. This was the most anticipated book of the year. I almost read this back in January instead of Dune Messiah, but I already had Dune Messiah, and I had this book on Libby, and it hadn't become available yet, so I defaulted to Dune Messiah. But this book is Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch, and it's the second book of the Gentleman Bastard series, which, if you follow my channel, you know was the number one book for me of 2022. So the eagerness I entered this world was outstanding, and I went into it with few expectations besides wanting to see Jean and Locke again. Like, I love their dynamic duo. They're one of my favorite dynamic duos. I could not wait to get into this book. And while it was my most anticipated book of the year, I will be surprised if it doesn't go down as my biggest disappointment too. And I really think it was a matter of what Brandon Sanderson calls promises, progress, and payoff. And I don't think this book was structured well at all, or at least for me. We had a great start that started us on this progress of an exciting adventure, but it wasn't the promise of the title or the cover. And then you get the promise of the the cover and title, but the progress doesn't make sense with the beginning of the book. And then it all gets wrapped up in this like it just did not flow for me. It did not work for me. My mind couldn't enjoy the story because I just always felt off balance. Another thing I'm going to say is, as far as like the swashbuckler fantasy goes, like being on the seas and having these epic battles on the seas, or just living on the sea in general, I think Sanderson's Tress of the Emerald Sea squashes this book by far. Honestly, argument exists that this book is a 4 out of 5 stars, but for me, because I went into it with such anticipation and how much it let me down, it's getting 3 out of 5 stars for me. And this may not be fair at all whatsoever, but it honestly made me enjoy Lies of Locke Lamora a little bit less too. And I know that's not fair. I know it's not fair. But if Lies of Locke Lamora would have been a one-off fantasy book, it would go down in history for me as being one of the greatest fantasy novels of all time. But when you have to look at it in the bigger part of a series, knowing that that's the best it gets and it only gets worse from there, it really lowers it in my book. I'm not saying that Lies of Locke Lamora isn't great. I'm saying that reading this book made me think less fondly back on Lies of Locke Lamora. But as we move on from that, we're also moving on from March. We are moving into April. So not only will this be a new month, but this will be me trying out a different audiobook application too. This one I listened to on the Barnes & Noble audiobook app, which I think is going to be a huge competitor to Audible, honestly. Like, I see it doing really great things right now. This next book will also be the second of the 3 books on this list that will be getting a full review from me. So make sure you like and subscribe to get notified when that review comes out. But this next book is Dreams of the Dying by Nicholas Litzau, I think. Litzau? I'm butchering that. This is a self-published book that you've probably heard about because of its amazing production value. You get so much with this book. I actually have the hardcover here. I'm going to be going over it in my full review, but it is gorgeous, outstanding. And the audiobook was no different. This was a self-published audiobook, and the voice acting and the way it was put together and the pronunciation of the language that he made up was outstanding. Like, second to none. The amount of work he's putting in is incredible. And I've got a lot to say about this book, which is why it's getting a full review. But I've got 3 big points about this book for this one. Number 1, this book is not for everybody. I'm sure if you've heard of this book before, you know it addresses topics like depression and suicidality, but that's the least of this. This book will show you in your mind's eye scenes of sexual violence, and in the most gruesome ways you can think of. It's terrible. If the depression and suicidality or sexual assault is a trigger, stay far away from this book. Don't even stay away. Like, this is not a book I recommend for everyone, and I would actually recommend people really think about before they read it. The second is that this book is full of these super long expositions. My notes for this actually say expositions. And these expositions are literally full of philosophies and ideologies that honestly remind me of Terry Goodkind's later work, but on the opposite spectrum. And I know a lot of people don't like this type of writing, and they throw it in at the beginning of the book when you're trying to adjust to a new world and a new landscape. It's really hard to get through. And then the third main point I wanted to make about this book is that I freaking loved it. Like, I could not put this down. It is the highest of 5 out of 5 stars, and I think will go down as one of my favorite books of the year. I'm not saying it's one of the greatest books of all time. I'm saying that this book will go down as one of my favorites. And the relationship between favorites and best is an interesting one, but we're not talking about that here. I have so much more to say about Dreams of the Dying. So once again, like and subscribe to get notified when that video drops. After that, we're continuing with the year of Sanderson with a Frugal Wizard's Guide to Medieval Europe. And I'm going to say something that might come across controversial, but Maybe not, I don't know. But I think that if anyone else but Brandon Sanderson had written this book, people would be giving it 5 out of 5 stars, at least 4 out of 5 stars. But because Sanderson is the one that wrote it, and people expect certain things from him, and all the expectations are of the highest expectations you can go into a book, I think it drops the quality of this book so much for so many people. It's not typical Sanderson, so it didn't meet a lot of people's expectations. It's also not fantasy at all, really. Like, it's science fiction. And it might be on the more soft side of science fiction, but it is science fiction through and through. This is not a fantasy novel, which I'm guessing is most of Brandon Sanderson's fan base. So I think that also probably lowers this book down for a lot of people reading it. It's a really fun book that is an excellent palate cleanser between other grimmer reads. I read this right after Dreams of the Dying. I think it was probably perfect timing. But I think I'm also probably with the majority of people on this, and where it wasn't my favorite. Like, it was just a good book for me. The character work wasn't the best in this. The plot didn't really get me excited. It was just a good book. The premise was fun, and I'll give this book 3 out of 5 stars. And honestly, I think I'm probably one of those people that if it wasn't Sanderson, if I had picked this book up from the science fiction shelf and said, hey, I'm going to go into this with just for a fun read, I think it probably would have gotten 4 stars at least for me. But because it's Sanderson, I think I had different expectations, which dropped it down to 3 out of 5 stars for me. And with the end of that book, I'm in May. Yes, May. And for those of you that follow the channel and know I average probably 3 books a month, you're probably like, is he barely averaging 2 books a month right now? The answer is yes. I spent the past few months studying for this huge medical school test that we take that determines like if we can get into the residency of our choosing. So most of my focus was on that, and it really cut back on the amount of books I read. I was literally like a hermit during my dedicated study period. Like, I think my wife took a picture of me when I left. I'll see if I can post that here just so you can see how I looked before and now. But in addition, I also have a child coming in July. Yay! So in addition to studying for the biggest test of my entire life, we've also been prepping the house and getting ready for the addition of our first child. So that's exciting as well. But like I said, now we're in May. And May is the best month. It is the best month I've ever had since starting BookTube. And I'll tell you why. It's because of a book called Shadow of the Torture by Gene Wolfe. It's the first half of Shadow and Claw, which is the first half of the Book of the New Sun. And all I can say about this is, woo! Like, I can't say enough good things. Like, for real, this is the best book I've ever read, and I cannot say enough great things about it. This is the 3rd book I'm going to be doing a full review of that I've read so far this year, and nothing I say about this book can do it even a fraction of the justice it deserves. This is a book that reads like fantasy, but is full-blown science fiction. The language Wolfe uses is that of fantasy books. He's saying knights and castles and wizards, when what he's really describing in the book is astronauts, rockets, and spaceships, and robots. This book has more layers than an ogre eating an onion, and is literally unlike anything I have read before. My summary of the book is going to be the story Severian, the book's main character, is telling, and not necessarily the story that Gene Wolfe is telling. And if that sounds weird, it is. But essentially, it's a coming-of-age story of an torturer's apprentice being expelled from his guild for showing a prisoner mercy. And I'll repeat, it is a coming-of-age tale of a boy becoming a man, but it's told in a way that is unlike any other you have ever read. Once expelled from the guild, Severian, our torturer's apprentice, then has to journey away from his home and discover that the world he's been living in is nothing like the world outside. That's honestly the best summary I can do, and that barely scratches the surface. I'm giving this book the highest 5 out of 5 stars, and it has actually taken the mantle of my favorite book of all time. Like, it beats Stormlight Archive. It beats any other inkling, anything else that could possibly come close. this book knocks out of the water. And I'll have a lot more to say about this in my full review I'll be putting up pretty soon. So once again, like and subscribe to get notified when that drops. After Shadow of the Torture, I jumped straight into Claw, but I haven't finished it yet. So Shadow of the Torture is going to be the last book that I've read so far this year. And don't judge me. Don't forget that I would look like this. But now I'm going to rank them from my favorite to my least favorite. And I'm doing that because, of course, you know that Shadow of the Torturer is my favorite book of all time. One note I will make about Shadow of the Torturer is, even though it is my favorite book of all time, and I think the greatest book ever written that I've read, I do want to say that I don't think this book is for everyone. I talked about how Assassin's Apprentice was unique and rare in the fact that it's a book I can universally recommend. Other books that come close are like Stormlight Archives, Harry Potter, Wheel of Time. Those are books that are generally universal recommendations. Shadow of the Torturer is not that by a long shot. But I think that those who do enjoy Shadow of the Torturer and read it the right way will love the book. And I think if you like this book, it almost automatically becomes your favorite of all time. And when I say, like, if you read it the right way, I will explain that in my full review, because part of that review is how to read Shadow of the Torturer and Book of the New Sun. But after Shadow of the Torturer, the other 5 stars I gave throughout this year is Dune Messiah, Trust of the Emerald Sea, Assassin's Apprentice, and Dreams of the Dying. And honestly, it's a tough decision between these next two, but I am going to put Dune Messiah above Dreams of the Dying. And I'm doing that just because Dreams of the Dying's writing is not even close to the level that Dune Messiah is. When I have two books that objectively, I like around the same, I do kind of fall back to the skill of the writer. And I think Frank Herbert knocks the socks off of Nicholas Latzau. So, as far as the, quality of the written book, I'm going to put Dune Messiah above Dreams of the Dying, even though, as far as pure enjoyment goes, they are very neck and neck. After that, I think this is going to make people mad, but I am going to put Atress ahead of Assassin's Apprentice. And it's honestly not at all about Assassin's Apprentice not being as good. It's just as good as Trust of the Emerald Sea by far, but I think it goes back to that time period I'm in right now. Right now, the Cosmere is a major part of my reading journey. The Cosmere is more important to me than the story of Fitz. And not only did Trust of the Emerald Sea, the story itself just slap hard, but it also added so much more depth to the Cosmere that I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of as we continue with other Cosmere books. So that is why I'm ranking Tress above Assassin's Apprentice for me. After Assassin's Apprentice comes my 4 stars, and the only one that hit 4 stars in this year so far is going to be Crimson Campaign, so that will be next. Which brings us to our 3 stars. And it's tough because Red Seas Under Red Skies, it brought back my favorite dynamic duo. It brought back Jean and Locke. And it let me back into the world of the Gentleman Bastards. But I think they really screwed the pooch on execution. I just didn't care for this book that much. Frugal Wizard was a really fun read, but didn't hit the mark for me. And then Bloody Rose is just mid. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just so mid that it just kind of fades into obscurity. I might forget, if it wasn't for being part of Kings of the Wild, the sequel to Kings of the Wild, I think I would completely forget that this was a book I read eventually. So out of these 3, I'm going to have to start with, my favorite of these 3 is going to be Frugal Wizards. I think that, mechanically, I think it was the most well written, while also being a fun romp and something different, which is really exciting. That's cool. After that, I'm going to put Red Seas Under Red Skies. I just love Jean and Locke so much, and this might be going ahead of Bloody Rose because of my love for Lies of Locke Lamora. And the book was good. I'm not saying it wasn't a good book. I'm just saying it failed to live up to my expectations. And then I'll go to Bloody Rose, almost because I just don't have a lot to say about this book. It wasn't memorable. But honestly, between those 3 books, those orders could change probably any given day of the week. I wouldn't be surprised if a month or two go by and I seem to be liking Red Seas way more than Frugal Wizard, or I talk about Bloody Rose a lot more than I talk about Red Seas. But for now, that's the order, and honestly, it feels good for me. And last, of course, for me is Empire of Silence. It's my only 2-star, and I do want to make a point. Like, this could have been a 1-star for me, but I do want to point out that Christopher, his writing was good. Like, it was really good. The prose he used and the way he set up and let his story flow, he had really good writing skills. And I'm not even saying he plagiarized the story. I want to make that clear. This story is not the same as Dune or the same as Book of the New Sun. Like, it's not the same. But what it did do was make it impossible for me to read the book without thinking about Dune. Like, it made me want to go back and finish Dune or reread the first Dune rather than sit down and enjoy this story. If you do have ties to another book, especially one so great, it has to be good enough. The story has to be good enough to make me stop thinking about what inspired the book and make me think about your story. And I don't think Empire of Silence was able to accomplish that. So do I think it's plagiarism? No, I do not. It did read like fan fiction of that world to me, and it made me keep thinking back to those old books. So Empire of Silence is the lowest rated book for me on this list. With that being said, I have no idea how long this video is going to be, but brings the video to the end. Make sure you like and subscribe to get notified when new videos drop. Like I said, I've got at least 3 reviews coming soon. And until next time, I hope you're out there reading cool new books and exploring cool new worlds, and I'll be back soon. Thanks for watching.